On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a flatbed truck backed up to the gate of the Lindquist place in Boone County, Nebraska, and let a load of walnut fall into the ditch grass. The driver never came down out of the cab. He worked the hydraulic ram until the slabs broke loose behind him, lifted 2 fingers off the wheel by way of greeting, then pulled out onto the gravel road and drove back toward Columbus with his mirrors shaking. Greta Lindquist stood in the driveway in her grandfather's canvas coat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier, watching the last piece roll off the pile and come to rest against a fence post. 2 cords, more or less. Some of the pieces 4 feet long, some of them barely 8 inches wide, every last one of them crooked or forked or twisted through the grain in a way that made it useless to the men who had loaded it. The pile steamed a little in the cold. It smelled like fresh-cut walnut, which is one of the finest smells on earth if you understand what walnut can be, and one of the cruelest smells on earth if you are 26 years old, with a farm sinking under you, and no idea yet what you are going to do about any of it. She was 26 that morning. She had been 26 for 11 days. The place ran to 340 acres of Boone County dirt, most of it corn ground, some of it too rolling, to be good for anything but pasture and hay. Her great-grandfather had broken it. Her grandfather had held it through the 50s and the 60s and the long, grinding 70s. In November, 4 months before that truck came, Halvor Lindquist had died at his workbench on a Sunday afternoon with a piece of wood in his hands, and the whole thing had come down to her, deed and debt together, because her brother had taken one look at the numbers and gone back to Omaha. The numbers were not complicated. That was the trouble with them. The place carried $180,000 in operating debt against equipment, worth maybe a third of that, and land the bank had already appraised twice in 18 months. Corn was sitting at $1.63 a bushel. In 1987, in that part of the state, that price was not a market condition. It was a sentence, and half the county was already serving it. There were 4 farms inside 8 miles of her gate that had gone at auction since Christmas, and at every one of them she had stood in the crowd, with her hands in her pockets, watching men she had known her whole life sell their grandfather's tools to strangers from 3 counties over. She had a letter in the house from the First National in Albion asking her to come in and sit down in June. It did not say anything else. It did not have to. The house was small, white, 90 years old, with a porch that needed a post replaced. The shop behind it was bigger than the house, which told you everything about the family that had built both. Halvor had put that shop up in 1961 with lumber salvaged out of a fallen barn, and inside it there was a metal lathe he had owned since 1968. A band saw that had belonged to his father before him, a drill press, 4 vises, a wall of chisels and gouges and draw knives hung on nails in the order he had liked them hung. Every wooden handle dark and glassy from 50 years of skin. Nothing in that building had been bought new. Nothing in that building had ever been thrown away. Greta had been in the shop maybe six times since the funeral, not because she could not stand it, because she could stand it perfectly well, which frightened her more. The pile at the gate had a history that started long before she was born. 14 miles east, in Columbus, the Meridian Casket Works had been building burial caskets since 1919, and by the 80s it was the largest operation of its kind between Omaha and the Colorado line. Casket manufacturing does not forgive. Every panel has to behave. The walnut that came into the Meridian yard was graded hard on arrival, and what the graders wanted was clear, straight, quiet wood, free of crotch, free of curl, free of the wild swirling patterns that make a board beautiful on a wall, but unpredictable in a press. Anything that failed got pulled off the stack and thrown in a corner of the yard. For 50 years they burned it. Then in 1971, a yard foreman named Wendell Prosser sat down with a pencil and figured out that hauling the reject pile to the dump was costing the company money it did not need to spend, and he started calling farmers in 3 counties who had wood stoves and shops and a truck. Halvor Lindquist had been the 4th name on that list. He had said yes without thinking about it much, the way a man says yes to anything free. He had burned the first 4 loads. Greta had heard the rest of the story so many times she could recite the pauses. How he had reached into the pile one afternoon in 1972 for something to feed the stove, come up with a slab about 30 inches long, and stopped in the middle of the shop floor with the stove door hanging open, because the grain in that piece curled around itself like water going past a rock, and the light coming through the west window seemed to be moving somewhere down inside the wood instead of sitting on top of it. He did not burn that piece. He set it on the bench. He looked at it for 3 days before he touched it with a tool. What he made from it was not good, and he knew it was not good, but it fit a pair of hands. That was the thing he could never get past. Greta was 11 years old before he let her hold a draw knife. 12 before he let her cut anything with it. The lesson she remembered was not a lesson at all. It was a Saturday in March of 1973, cold enough that the stove was running hard, and he had come in from the yard with a piece of the Meridian, reject wood under his arm, laid it on the bench in front of her, pulled the stool over, and told her to sit down and look at it. She had looked at it for about 40 seconds. Then she had asked him what he wanted her to do with it. He had not answered that. He had gone back to whatever he was doing at the far bench, leaving her sitting there with her feet not touching the floor. She sat for 10 minutes out of stubbornness, then 20 out of confusion. At some point, she began turning the slab over. At some point after that, she began tilting it toward the window to see what the light did, which was the first honest thing she had done all morning. He kept her at it for 3 days. Not all day and not without letting her eat or go to school, but every hour she was in that shop for 3 days. That piece of wood sat in front of her, and the only instruction she got was to keep looking. On the 3rd evening, he came over, put one thick finger on a spot 2 inches from the end where the grain swept up out of the flat and turned, and told her that was where it would split if she ever put a chisel to it wrong. She asked him how he knew. He picked up his coffee. His voice came out flat, without any weight on it, the way he delivered anything he actually believed. Because I ruined 11 pieces before I learned to see it, and you just saved yourself 9 of them by sitting on that stool. 14 years later, she could look at the end grain of a Boone County walnut slab the way a doctor looks at film on a light box. The density of the rings that meant slow growth on a hard hillside. The rays that ran across the grain and told you whether a piece would hold its shape or fight you every winter of its life. The run out at the edges that showed exactly where the wood was strong, exactly where it wanted to come apart. She knew that the local walnut, the trees that grew crowded in the river breaks and along the fence hedges, where the wind bent them for 80 years, took oil differently than the plantation-grown wood the catalogs sold. She knew it needed 2 years of air drying for every inch of thickness in that climate, and that anybody who told you otherwise had never opened a piece in February and found a check running down the middle of 9 months of work. She knew because she had ruined 23 of them. Halvor kept a running count in the back of the 3rd ledger with no comment beside any of the entries except the date, which was somehow worse than a comment. She had made her first complete stock blank at 15. She had made her best 1-2 weeks before he died, and he had held it up under the window for a long time without saying anything, then set it down and gone back to work, which from him was closer to a parade than anything she was ever going to get. There were 31 of them in the shop that March morning, hanging on pegs along the north wall, oil-finished, the figure in some of them so deep it looked wet. Neighbors had 5 or 6 more. Her brother had one he kept in a closet in Omaha and had never once mentioned. Halvor had sold exactly 2 in his life, both of them to a man in Grand Island, both of them for $80. Both of those prices a thing Greta would come to understand, as a kind of quiet crime committed against him by his own modesty. She carried the cold coffee back to the house, dumped it in the sink, stood at the window over the basin, and looked at the pile out by the gate for a while longer. That afternoon, she drove into Albion for a starter solenoid, and while she waited on the counterman at the co-op, she heard her name from 4 feet away without anybody actually addressing her. Cy Barlow ran the implement dealership on the north edge of town, held court at that counter most days between 10 and noon, and had opinions about every operation within 30 miles, whether he had ever set foot on it or not. He was not a cruel man. He was something more ordinary than cruel. He was a man who had decided a long time ago that the only real work was work that scaled, and everything else was a hobby that a person pursued instead of facing facts. He was telling two men by the seed rack that old Halvor's granddaughter was out there, trying to farm 340 acres by herself, with corn where it was, that she ought to take whatever the bank would give her and go find something in Columbus with a paycheck attached, that there was no shame in it. One of the men glanced over and saw her standing there. Barlow did not. He kept going. He got as far as the part about how she was welcome to come to him for an honest appraisal on the equipment before the auctioneers picked her clean, and it was the word picked that landed. She paid for the solenoid. She walked out past the three of them without altering her stride, got into the truck, and sat there in the parking lot with her hands on the wheel until her jaw came loose. Then she drove east instead of west 14 miles to Columbus to the Meridian Yard, because she needed to hear one man tell her one true thing that day. Wendell Prosser was 61 years old, had a bad hip from a forklift in 1974, and had known her since she was small enough to ride in the cab of Halvor's truck on delivery days. He came out of the yard office wiping his hands. He told her he had heard about her grandfather, that he had liked him better than most people he had done business with in 40 years, that Halvor never once complained about what was in a load or asked for something better. She asked him whether the loads would keep coming to her. He looked at her for a second, too long before he answered, which she would remember later. Then he told her the arrangement was the arrangement, that nobody upstairs had ever cared where the reject stack went as long as it went, that she should keep the gate clear, and he would keep the truck coming. Driving home, she did the arithmetic she had been avoiding for 4 months. The pile had value, or it did not. If it did not, she was a woman with a dying farm sitting on 2 cords of firewood. If it did, she was a woman with a dying farm sitting on something else, and she had no idea what the something else was worth, because nobody in her family had ever found out. That night she went into the house, turned on the lamp in the front room, and opened her grandfather's desk for the first time since the funeral. She had put it off for 4 months, telling herself it was the tax papers she did not want to face. That was not it. The desk was a roll top with a broken lock, and every drawer in it smelled like him. Pipe smoke that had soaked into the wood, machine oil, the particular dust of a house where a man had lived alone. The bottom drawer held the ledgers. 2 of them she knew. The record of every significant piece of walnut that had come through the shop since 1972, the source, the dimensions, the figure grade in Halvor's private 4-tier system, the date it went into the barn to dry, the date it came out, what it became. 2,000 entries in 15 years, written in a hand that got smaller as the pages filled. The third ledger she had never seen open. It was the same size, the same cloth cover, but the first 40 pages had nothing to do with wood. They were phone numbers. Names of furniture shops in Norfolk and Fremont, a stair builder in Grand Island, 2 flooring outfits, a millwork operation in Wahoo, a custom cabinet shop in Seward. Beside each name, in his hand, a note about what species they ran and how much they threw out. Some of the entries were dated 1979. Some were dated later. Not one of them had a checkmark beside it. Not one of them had a second entry showing he had ever picked up a telephone. Folded into the back of that ledger, soft along the creases from handling, was a letter 4 pages long on plain typing paper, postmarked Roseburg, Oregon, August of 1979, signed August Rennick. She read it standing up. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the desk and read it again. Rennick had been building stocks by hand since 1958. Halvor had evidently written to him with a list of questions, because the letter answered them, in order, patiently the way a man writes when he has decided the person on the other end is worth 4 pages of his evening. It covered wood selection. It covered the geometry of a stock, the relationship between the length of pull and the height of the comb, the way a stock has to answer to an actual human body in a way that factory work never bothers to. It described the shift in the market, the rising cost of good walnut, the European furniture buyers, and the overseas mills bidding American black walnut away from American makers, the way domestic manufacturers had responded by going thin and plain and synthetic, and the way that response had cracked open a space at the top of the market that a small number of men were filling at $400 a stock and climbing. On the third page, Rennick had written the sentence that put Greta Lindqvist on the floor of her grandfather's front room at 11 o'clock at night, with her hand over her mouth. He wrote that regional walnut, cut from one geography, dried and worked over years by somebody who understood the specific behavior of that particular wood, was worth more in the trade than generic imported blanks, because the man working it possessed knowledge that could not be purchased, only accumulated. He wrote that Halvor should stop treating it as something he did after chores. He wrote that there was a market waiting, that it was small. That small was not the same as poor. The letter closed with an offer to answer anything else Halvor wanted to ask. Greta went back through the desk. She went through every drawer, every folder, the metal box where he kept the tax records, the coffee can on the shelf where he kept receipts. There was no carbon, no draft, no envelope, nothing. In 7 years, he had never written back. She sat there a long time. She was not angry at first. What came first was something closer to vertigo, the floor tilting, because for 14 years, she had believed her grandfather worked in that shop for the reason he gave, which was that a man ought to have something to do with his hands in the evening. Now she was holding 4 pages that said he had known. He had known in 1979 what the wood was, what the market was, what he could have been. He had put the letter in a ledger, filled 40 pages with the names of shops he never called, gone out to the barn, stacked another season of walnut to dry, then died in November with $180,000 of debt on the place and 31 stocks hanging on a wall. The anger arrived around 1 in the morning, and it did not arrive the way she expected. She was not angry that he had failed. She was angry that he had never even tried, that he had spent 7 years being right in private, that the thing standing between the Lindqvist family and something better had never been the wood or the market or the county. She said it out loud to an empty house because there was nobody left to say it to. He had the hands, he just never had the nerve. Then she said something else, quieter, which was the first fair thought she had that night, that it is one thing to know what you are worth. It is another thing entirely to make a stranger look at it. She did not sleep. Around 4, she went out to the shop, turned on the lights, and started pulling stalks off the north wall. For the next 3 weeks, she worked the farm in daylight and worked the problem after dark. In late March, she drove to Columbus with 4 of the best pieces wrapped in moving blankets in the back seat, laid them out on the hood of the truck in the parking lot of a drugstore at 10 in the morning, and shot 2 rolls of film with Halvor's 35mm camera. Cloudy light, no flash. The wood turned at 4 different angles because she had learned by then. That figure does not photograph the way it looks. She paid for the developing out of grocery money. 4 days later, she picked up the prints, sat in the truck, and went through them one at a time. 12 of them were good. 2 of them were better than good. In one of them, the curl in a piece of crotch-figured walnut came up off the paper in a way that made the drugstore clerk lean over the counter and ask what it was a picture of. She had a trade directory that Halvor had ordered in 1981 and never marked up. 60 pages of custom rifle builders, gunsmiths, sporting goods dealers, and stock suppliers listed by state. She went through it at the kitchen table over 2 nights with a legal pad. Crossed off the ones that advertised their own wood. Crossed off the biggest names, because she did not want the first person to see her work to be somebody who saw 50 pieces a week. Then made a list of 12, 4 custom builders, 5 gun shops, 2 dealers, 1 man in Oregon. She wrote to Rennick first. She told him who she was, whose granddaughter she was, that she had found his letter, that it had been kept for 8 years, that she was sorry it had never been answered. She did not ask him for anything. She sealed it before she could talk herself into asking. The other 11 letters were the same letter, retyped 11 times on Halvor's underwood, single-spaced, one page. She described the wood, where it came from, why the figure was there, how long it dried, what she did to it. She described the 4-tier grading system in 3 sentences without calling it a system. She enclosed 2 photographs in each envelope. She listed a price. The price took her 4 hours to arrive at, which she would find funny later, in the way that things are funny only after they have stopped costing you money. She had $160 of actual market information in her life, which was 2 stocks her grandfather had sold in Grand Island in 1976. Everything else was guesswork. She knew Rennick's letter mentioned $400 in 1979. She also knew what she looked like on paper. Nobody from nowhere with no name behind her, writing to men who had never heard of her family. So she took Rennick's number, cut it under half, added $25, because a round number seemed like something a beginner would write, and put $185 on the page. She mailed all 12 on the 9th of April from the post office in Albion. It cost her $4.40. She stood on the sidewalk afterward, feeling exactly as foolish as a person feels when they have just told 12 strangers what they can do. Then the spring came at her, the way it does, and she had no time to feel anything at all. She was in the field by the 15th. 340 acres is not a large operation, but it is more than enough for one person with an 18-year-old tractor and a planter that needed a bearing she was rebuilding instead of replacing. She was up at 4:30. She was in bed by 10. She checked the mailbox at the end of the lane every afternoon coming in from the field, and every afternoon it held the electric bill, the co-op flyer, a seed catalog, a card from her aunt in Sioux Falls. Nels called from Omaha the first week of May. He was 34, had done 10 years in agricultural equipment sales, wore his hair the way men in Omaha wore it, and loved her in the specific unhelpful way of a brother who has already made his own escape. He asked how the planting had gone. He asked whether she had heard from the bank. Then he came to it, because he had called to come to it. There was a fellow he knew who could move the whole line of equipment before harvest. Take her position on the ground contract. Hand her a check with a number on it that had a 5 in front. She could be in Omaha by August. She could be done with all of it. She stood in the kitchen with the cord wrapped once around her wrist, looking out at the shop, listening to her brother explain her own life to her, at long-distance rates. She told him she had written some letters. He wanted to know what kind of letters. She told him. There was a pause on the line that went on long enough to be an answer by itself. And then he asked, carefully, in the voice menus when they are, trying not to be cruel to somebody they think is drowning, whether she really believed a person could sell a piece of wood off a farm in Boone County for the price of a used car. She looked at the 31 stocks she had hung back on the wall that morning. Grandpa believed it in 1979, her thumb working the cord flat against the counter. He just never mailed the letter. I mailed the letter. Nels let it go. He told her to call him when the bank set a date. He told her he loved her. Both of those things were true, and neither of them was any use to her at all. The first answer came on the 16th of May. It was a polite rejection from a gun shop in Sioux City, 3 sentences, thanking her for the inquiry and explaining that they had a supplier arrangement in place. The second came 4 days later from a dealer in Kansas, almost identical, with the additional information that they were not currently taking on new sources. She read them both twice, put them in the drawer, went back out to the field. On the 28th of May, a man in Wisconsin wrote to ask what her lead time was on 20 pieces. She answered that same night. She never heard from him again. June came. 8 envelopes had produced nothing at all, which she understood was not a rejection so much as a verdict about whether she existed. She went to the bank on the 11th. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The loan officer was decent about it, which somehow made the room worse, and what he told her came down to this. The operating note would not be renewed at the current level in the fall unless the position improved. Not could not. Would not. He used the phrase demonstrated ability to service. He said there was no need to make any decisions in June, that a person had until harvest, that he had known her grandfather. She drove home with the windows down. She did not cry in the parking lot, or on the highway, or in her own driveway. She got out of the truck, walked past the house, went into the shop, sat on the stool at the north bench, where she had sat when she was 12 years old, and put her hands flat on the wood. The mail that day was in her coat pocket. She had picked it up on the way through Albion without looking at it. There were 3 pieces: the bill from the implement dealer, a church newsletter, and a business envelope from Scottsdale, Arizona, addressed in a slanted architect's hand, with a return address that read Vance Stockwork and Rifle. Inside there were 2 things. The letter was 6 lines. It told her the photographs had come across his desk in April, that he had set them aside twice and gone back to them both times, which was not his habit. It told her that he had been looking for a reliable domestic walnut source for 3 years, and had not found one that could deliver figure with the grain running where it needed to run. It told her to send 6 pieces, his choice of dimensions, matched as closely as she could to the samples in the photographs. It said he would fit them himself, that he would call her afterward, that she should not take his silence in the meantime as anything but a man working. The last line said that, if the wood came out of the box the way it looked on paper, he would want more of it than she was going to be able to make. The second thing in the envelope was a check for $1,110, drawn on a bank in Maricopa County, signed Emery Vance. Greta sat on the stool in her grandfather's shop with a check in one hand for 6 pieces of wood that a casket factory had thrown into a ditch, and for about 90 seconds she was not able to make herself stand up. Then she stood up. She built those 6 stock blanks in 41 nights. 28 of them were nights after full days in the field. 9 were nights after days spent fixing something that had broken during the day in the field. 4 were rain days, all the way through, dark to dark, which were the only days that felt like enough. She started at 9 or 9:30 most evenings, when the light outside was finally gone, and the stove had the shop warm, and she worked until her hands began making decisions ahead of her head, which she had learned at 17 was the exact moment to put the tool down. She went into the barn on the first night and pulled 46 candidates off the drying racks. By the 3rd night, she was down to 19. By the end of the first week, she had 11 pieces laid out on the bench under the window, and she stood there with her arms crossed for the better part of an hour on a Sunday afternoon, looking at the end grain of each of them, because 6 was the number, and 11 was still 5 too many. She used Halvor's grading system, then went past it. His 4 tiers had been built for his own purposes, a shorthand a man uses talking to himself. She was picking now for somebody who was going to put a machine screw through this wood, hang 8 pounds of steel off it, and hand it to a customer who would carry it up a mountain. 2 of the 11 had figure that would have made anybody stop in the aisle at a show. Both of them had the figure running crosswise through the wrist, right where the whole load of a rifle passes through the narrowest part of the stock. She took both of them off the bench and put them back on the rack. That decision cost her nothing that night. It became, 4 months later, the single most valuable thing she had ever done. She cut the blanks oversize. She let them sit 3 days. She checked them, found a hair of movement in one, took that one out entirely, replaced it with a plainer piece that she knew in her bones would never fail. She shaped with the draw knife she had learned on. She used a spoke shave on the combs. She scraped instead of sanding wherever the figure went wild, because sandpaper on curl leaves the grain torn under the finish, where nobody sees it until the oil goes on and the whole surface comes up cloudy. There was one stretch in the 2nd week when the heat came in and the shop would not cool below 90 after dark, so she moved the whole operation outside onto sawhorses under the yard light, working in a cloud of moths with a drop cord over her shoulder. And she would remember the sound of that summer for the rest of her life, which was the draw knife going through walnut, with 100 insects hitting a bulb above her head. She oiled them by hand, 7 coats, 48 hours between coats, rubbing each one out with her palm until the friction got hot enough to hurt. On the last night, she carried all 6 out to the middle of the floor, stood them against the bench in a row, turned off the overheads, and lit them with the single lamp on the wall, the way she had watched her grandfather do 100 times without ever asking why. Under one light, from one angle, the figure moves. That is the whole test. Wood that only looks alive under fluorescent tubes is wood that will disappoint somebody 1,000 miles away in a room you will never see. All 6 moved. She built the crate the next morning out of scrap pine, packed the blanks in newspaper and old bath towels, weighed the whole thing on the feed scale in the barn, drove it to the depot in Columbus, and paid $31 to ship it. Then she came home and went back to work, because it was the end of July, and the corn did not care what was in that crate. 6 weeks went by. She would remember that stretch as the longest of her life to that point, longer than the 4 months after the funeral, because grief has a shape to it and waiting does not. She hoed beans, she rebuilt a hydraulic cylinder, she fixed the porch post. She caught herself, twice, standing still in the middle of a task, with her hands hanging, calculating the number of days it takes a man in Arizona to inlet 6 stocks. She stopped going out to the shop in the evenings entirely, because the north wall was empty now where the best 6 had hung, and she found she did not like looking at it. On the 3rd of September, a Thursday, at 6:40, in the evening, with the light going amber across the yard and the kitchen window open, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was older than she expected, dry, unhurried, a West Texas, underneath it that 50 years in Arizona had sanded down without removing. He confirmed her name. He told her he had the 6 pieces on his bench in front of him at that moment, 3 of them already inletted, that he had been at it 11 days. Then he went through them one at a time in order for 6 or 7 minutes with the particular thoroughness of a man who has decided the person on the other end of the line is capable of hearing the whole truth. Number 4 had a grain orientation through the wrist that he was not going to use on a rifle built for hard country. He said it plainly, without softening it, and he said it was not a defect in the wood, it was a defect in the choice, and she would know why the moment she thought about it. Then he told her that the other 5 were the best domestic blanks he had put a chisel into in 10 years. He told her that the figure in the second one had made him get up and carry it to a window. He told her that the wood cut clean, that it took an edge the way properly seasoned material does, that whoever had dried it had not been in a hurry, which in his experience was the rarest quality in American walnut, and could not be faked at any price. She was standing at the counter with the receiver against her ear, one hand flat on the formica, not saying anything, because if she opened her mouth, she was not sure what was going to come out of it. Then he said the thing that changed the rest of her life, and he said it in a tone of mild irritation, like a man correcting a bill. Now I'm going to tell you what's wrong with your operation. A chair moved on the other end. Your price is an insult, not to me, to you. She got out 4 words. It's what I calculated. Then you calculated with bad numbers, because you didn't have any. He let that sit for a second. I've got a customer who will pay $2,800 for a rifle, with the second piece on it. The wood is carrying at least 350 of that. I could pay you $185 and sleep fine for about 2 years. Right up until the morning, you figure out what you've got, and quit on me. I don't want to buy cheap from somebody who's going to disappear. He told her the number. $275 apiece. Standard, everything in that grade or above. He told her he wanted 12 more before the end of the year, that he would keep the 4th piece for a shotgun of his own rather than send it back, that he wanted right of first refusal on her production for as long as she cared to give it to him, and that if she ever got a piece she thought was exceptional, she was to call him before she called anybody, at any price she named. She heard herself ask him why he was telling her any of this. Men did not generally talk themselves into paying more. There was a pause on the line, long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. Because in 1961 I sold 12 rifles for less than the steel cost me, and the man who could have told me stood right there and didn't. Took me 9 years to get that back. Something set down hard on a bench in Arizona. You're 26. You've got 100 years of that wood behind you and no idea what it's worth. Somebody's going to tell you. It might as well be somebody who wants you to still be there in 10 years. After she hung up, she stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on the lights. What he had given her was not a better price. She understood that even that night, standing there with the receiver still warm in the cradle, he had given her a location. For 14 years, she had been working in a room with no windows, doing something skillfully with absolutely no way to know how skillfully, judging her own work against her own work, which is a closed circuit that will keep a person honest but will never make them accurate. Halvor had lived his whole life inside that circuit. He had gotten one letter from Oregon in 1979 telling him where he actually stood, and it had frightened him so badly that he filed it in a ledger and never touched a stamp. She got the same information at 26, over a telephone, from a stranger in Scottsdale, and the difference between her grandfather and herself would come down to nothing more complicated than what each of them did in the following week. She did the arithmetic at the kitchen table with a pencil. 12 blanks at $275 was $3,300. Against $180,000 of debt, it was not a rescue. It was not even close enough to a rescue to be worth the word. If she gave that number to the loan officer in Albion, he would write it down politely, thank her, then set the same appointment for the fall. She sat with that for a long time. Then she turned the pencil around and worked it from the other end, which was the first time she ever thought about the thing the way a manufacturer thinks about it, instead of the way a farmer thinks about it. 12 pieces was what one man in one shop in Arizona could absorb in 6 months. There were roughly 1,100 names in that directory. She had written to 11 of them and gotten one. If the rate held, and it would not, but if it held, 60 letters was 6 customers, and 6 customers was 72 pieces a year, and 72 pieces at $275 was $19,800 off the back end of a barn, full of wood that arrived at her gate for free. $19,800 was not a rescue either. It was something better than a rescue. It was a demonstrated ability to service. She looked at the phone. It was after 11. She thought about calling Nels, then decided against it, not out of spite, but because she could hear exactly how the conversation would go. And she was not interested in defending something that was 5 hours old. Instead, she went to the drawer, took out the check from Arizona, and looked at it for a while. She had not cashed it. She had carried it in the truck for 2 days, then put it in the desk, and some part of her had been waiting for the phone call to tell her whether it was real. She got up, went into the front room, opened the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk, took out the third ledger, and turned to the 40 pages of shop names that her grandfather had gathered over 7 years without ever picking up a telephone. Furniture in Norfolk, stair builder in Grand Island, mill work in Wahoo, flooring in Fremont, names and numbers in a small, careful hand. A whole second life mapped out in ink by a man who had walked right up to it every winter for 7 years, and then gone out to the barn to stack more wood. Underneath the last entry, there was a line she had missed the first night, because it was in the margin, turned sideways, written smaller than the rest. The wood was never the problem. She read it 4 times. Then she took the ledger out to the shop with her. It was full dark by then, past midnight, the kind of black that only exists 9 miles from a paved road. She crossed the yard with the ledger under her arm, and out at the gate the March pile had gone down by maybe a third, the rest of it silvering on the outside the way walnut does when weather gets at it, hiding what it was under a gray skin. She stood inside the shop front door in the dark, for a moment, without reaching for the switch, the way her grandfather used to, which was a habit she had never understood as a child, and understood completely at 26. You stand in the dark first, so that when the lights come on, you see the room instead of just walking through it. The empty pegs on the north wall, the lathe, the draw knife on its nail, with the handle worn to the shape of 2 different hands. She reached over and turned on the lights. She went back to the First National in Albion on the 14th of October, 1987, with a manila folder instead of an explanation. Inside it were four things: a photocopy of a check for $1,110, cashed; a purchase order from Scottsdale for 12 pieces at $275 apiece, dated September, 3 of them already delivered; a second order, 6 pieces, from a builder in Bozeman, Montana named Merle Ferreter, who had found her the way everybody in that trade eventually found everybody, which was one man telling another man over a telephone that there was somebody in Nebraska worth writing to. The fourth thing was a single page in her own handwriting showing what the barn held, what it would yield, what it was worth at the price 2 strangers had already paid. The loan officer read all 4. He set them down. He asked her how much of the wood she paid for. None of it. Her hands folded on the edge of his desk. It gets dumped at my gate by a company that would otherwise pay to burn it. She left with the operating note restructured over 5 years at a number that hurt every month rather than a number that killed her once. It was not a victory. It was an extension. Driving out past the grain elevator, she understood clearly, for the first time, that the farm was now the thing standing between her and the work, instead of the other way around, which was a sentence she would not have been able to say out loud in that county without being laughed at. She wrote 40 more letters that winter. She did it the way she had done the first 12, on Halvor's Underwood, at the kitchen table, from November through the first week of February, working through the trade directory state by state. 31 of them produced nothing. 6 produced polite rejections. 2 produced men who wanted samples shipped free and were told no. 1 produced Lemuel Ostrander, who ran a shop in Kansas City that sold blanks over the counter to men who liked doing their own fitting, who ordered 4 pieces, then 8, then 14, then stopped asking her what the price was because he had learned that she would not move it. The last one produced a letter from Roseburg, Oregon, in a hand she recognized off the envelope before she opened it, because she had spent a night on the floor with 4 pages of it 8 months earlier. August Rennick was 71 years old by then, still working, cutting his own checkering. He wrote that he had thought about her grandfather off and on for 8 years, that he had assumed the silence meant the man had died or lost interest, that finding out it had been neither was harder to sit with than either. He wrote 3 pages about drying, 1 about her photographs, half a page about what happens to a small maker who takes on a partner with a warehouse. That half page did not mean anything to her in February of 1988. She read it once, put it in the folder with the rest, forgot it entirely. The last paragraph she did not forget. He told her she would spend the next several years being offered arrangements that sounded like security, that every one of them would be a proposal to buy her name for less than it was going to be worth, that she should count on being wrong about which offer was which at least once. Then he signed it, and under his name he wrote a line she copied onto a card that stayed tacked over the north bench for 20 years. You are not selling wood. You are selling the 20 years somebody spent learning to look at it. She raised her price in March of 1988, from $275 to $300, and lost nobody. She raised it again in January of 1989 to $340 for standard, $475 for the pieces she graded at the top tier, the ones where the figure came up through the wrist correctly, and the color ran deep enough that a man would turn the whole stock over in his hands twice before he said anything. Ferreter took 10 that year. Ostrander took 22. Vance took 18, then wrote in October asking whether she had ever thought about what would happen if she got sick. A bespoke builder in Pennsylvania named Bertrand Hollenbeck found her through Ostrander in the spring of 1989. He built 4 or 5 rifles a year for men with money who wanted American walnut that behaved like the imported material they had seen in European catalogs, meaning deep, figured, with the color variation that only shows up in wood dried slowly by somebody who had no reason to rush. He bought 6 pieces the first year. He paid without being asked twice, which in that business made him rare. There was a 5th man that year who lasted 6 weeks. He ran a shop in Michigan, ordered 3 pieces, then called in June, wanting to know whether she could supply him with fiddlebacks, specifically a dozen a year, matched close enough that 2 rifles built 18 months apart would look like brothers. She told him no. She told him the figure in a piece of walnut is the tree's own record of everything that happened to it, that she could not order it any more than he could order a particular October, that what she sold was the certainty that the piece would be exceptional, without any promise about how. He wanted to know what he was paying for then. She heard herself answer before she had decided to. "You're paying to be surprised by something better than what you'd have thought to ask for." He canceled. She let him go without a second letter, then stood at the window afterward, wondering whether she had just turned down $4,000 a year, out of principle, or out of pride, unable to tell the two apart, aware that she would be finding out one way or the other. 4 customers. That was the whole operation in 1989. A farm in Boone County, a barn full of racked walnut, 4 telephone numbers on a card by the wall phone in the kitchen. She built 104 blanks that year. Her gross from wood was $39,200. The farm, 340 acres, worked by one woman, with an 18-year-old tractor, in the 4th year of the worst commodity stretch since the Depression, cleared $14,100. She did that arithmetic in December at the same kitchen table where she had once sat with a pencil calculating what 60 letters might be worth. And the 2 numbers sat there on the legal pad looking at each other, and something in her rearranged itself permanently. She did not stop farming. She was 28 years old. She had been raised by a man who believed land was the only real thing. That belief was in her spine, not her head, where it could not be argued with. But she stopped thinking of the shop as the thing she did after the day was over. She rented out 90 acres of the rolling ground to the Halvorson place that spring, which freed up 11 days a season. She spent all 11 of them in the shop. Old Rolf Halvorson came over to sign the lease at her kitchen table, then sat there afterward with his hat on his knee for 20 minutes, working his way around to something. What he finally said was that his father had bought a stock off Halvor in 1968 for $40, that it was still on a rifle in his closet, that his own son had asked about it at Thanksgiving. He wanted to know whether she would look at it sometime and tell him what it was. She told him to bring it over. He never did. Men in that county did not bring things over. They thought about bringing things over for years. In April of 1989, she ran into Cy Barlow outside the parts counter in Albion. The first time since he had discussed her future within earshot 2 years before. He asked how she was making out. She told him she was doing fine. He told her he had heard she was selling gunstocks to people out of state, which he pronounced the way a man pronounces a word he has decided in advance is a small word. Then ask what a person got for something like that, more out of habit than curiosity. She looked at him for a second, decided he was not worth the truth, told him it depended on the piece. Later, she would recognize that moment as a failure of nerve so ordinary she had not even felt it happen. Barlow went back to his counter, believing exactly what he had believed before. She drove home with the taste of it in her mouth. Von Merrick called her on the 22nd of February 1990 at 7 in the morning, which she understood later was deliberate. He was regional sales director for a firearms accessories company out of Minneapolis, a name she knew from the back pages of every magazine in the trade, a company that sold slings, cases, cleaning kits, mounts, all of it competently made. None of it made by anybody's hands in particular. He had heard about her from a colleague, who had heard about her from Hollenbeck in Pennsylvania. His voice was pleasant in the specific frictionless way of a man who has made 4,000 cold calls. He told her the company was building a premium line of replacement stocks for the domestic market, that they were looking for a walnut source with a story attached to it, that the volumes would be meaningful. He used the phrase several hundred units annually. He asked whether she would be open to a conversation. She told him he could come out in March if the roads were clear. He arrived on the 19th in a company truck with the logo on the door, wearing a company jacket with the same logo stitched over the heart, carrying a leather folio that he set on the workbench without asking. He was 46 years old, in good condition, with the easy physical confidence of a man who had played something in college. He shook her hand hard. He looked around the shop for about 11 seconds, taking in the salvaged rafters, the stove, the 50-year-old tool wall, then produced a smile that she had seen before on men appraising equipment at farm auctions. He was there 3 hours. He picked up 9 finished blanks, turned each one over, held 2 of them up to the window, set them down in the wrong order. He asked about drying time, then asked twice more in different words, as though he suspected the first answer of being a boast. He asked about dimensional consistency. He asked what her monthly output ceiling was if she stopped farming entirely. He asked whether she had ever considered a kiln. She told him a kiln would destroy the color. He wrote that down. He used the word scalable 3 times before noon. He asked her to walk him through how she graded, so she did, all 4 tiers, out loud, in front of him, with a piece in her hand for each one. She showed him what run-out looked like at the edge of a blank. She showed him why one piece with spectacular figure was worth less than a quieter piece, with the grain running where it needed to run. She explained her grandfather's system the way she would have explained it to anybody who asked a serious question. Because in 29 years, nobody outside the family had ever asked. And because there is a specific hunger in a person who has been good at something in private for a long time. He wrote all of it down in the leather folio in a small, quick hand. He asked her, without looking up, whether the 4 tiers had names or numbers. She told him her grandfather had used numbers. He asked whether she had ever considered giving them names, since numbers do not travel well, then answered his own question before she could. Names travel, numbers get argued about. She noticed the pen. She did not think anything about it. That was the single most expensive thing she failed to think about in her life. He asked to see the ledgers. She told him they were in the house, then heard herself add, out of a caution she could not have explained at the time, that they were mostly her grandfather's handwriting and mostly illegible. He let it go with a shrug, which she took for indifference. It was not indifference. He had already gotten the part he came for, standing at a bench with a piece of walnut in his hand, from a woman who had waited 29 years for somebody to ask her a serious question about her work. Then they went into the kitchen. He took the chair her grandfather had always taken, and he laid the arrangement out. The company would take exclusive rights to her entire production. They would set specifications, dimensions, grade standards, finish. They would pay $210 per unit standard, $290 premium. They wanted a minimum commitment of 300 units a year, with capacity to reach 600 inside 36 months, which would require her to hire, which they would help her plan for. There would be a marketing program built around the origin of the material. There would be a check every month, whether the market moved or not. She let him finish. Then she told him her current numbers. 340 standard, 475 for top grade. 90% collected within 30 days. He was ready for it. He did not blink. He explained that she was comparing the wrong things, that 4 customers buying in small batches was not a market. It was 4 relationships. That relationships end when men retire or die. That volume is what survives a person's individual customers. He explained that per unit price is a vanity metric. He explained that the company's marketing would build recognition in 18 months that she could not build alone in 15 years. Every one of those statements was true. That was the part she found hardest to think through afterward. She told him she would consider it. She called Vance that night. He listened, asked 2 questions about the exclusivity language, then told her flatly not to sign it, that a small supplier who signs an exclusive with a large buyer hands over the price forever, that the 210 would still be 210 in 1998, that she would spend a decade building somebody else's name onto her own wood. She called Ferreter and Bozeman the next morning. He was blunter. His whole opinion took 9 seconds. Her wood had a reputation because she controlled it. The minute she handed over control, the reputation stopped being hers. Both of those calls mattered. Neither of them decided anything. because she had already found the actual reason 4 days earlier. Standing in the barn with a flashlight, at 11 o'clock at night, looking at a rack of blanks that had come off the same tree. She had gone out there to think about 300 units. 300 units meant specifications. Specifications meant somebody in an office in Minneapolis writing a sentence describing what the figure had to look like. Then, a woman in Nebraska going into a barn to find wood that matched the sentence. She stood there running the beam across 9 pieces, cut from one crotch, and understood that no two of them could be described by the same sentence. That this was not a limitation of her operation. That this was the entire product. She called Merrick on the 26th. She did not lead with price, which surprised him. She told him she could not sign because the arrangement required her to promise in advance what the wood would look like. That the figure in a walnut tree is a record of 80 years of the tree's own history, wind, injury, competition for light on a riverbank, that it cannot be ordered, only found. She told him she sold uncertainty on purpose, that her customers paid a premium precisely because they did not know exactly what was coming until the crate was open. There was a silence on the line while he decided which version of himself to be. He chose reasonable first. He told her that was a beautiful way to describe a supply problem. He told her that every craftsman he had ever met had said something similar right up until the moment the market taught them otherwise. He told her the custom trade was too small to sustain what she was trying to build, that without volume she would be a cottage operation her whole life, that in 5 years she would be doing exactly what she was doing now, in the same building, for the same 4 men, older. Then he thanked her for her time in a voice with all the warmth taken out of it, the way you thank a waitress you are never going to see again. She hung up and went out to work. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way a person feels after backing down a dog that did not actually bite. Heart going, nothing to show for it, no way to know whether she had judged it right. 4 months later, she found out. Wendell Prosser called her on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of July, and she knew from the first 3 words that he had been putting the call off. The Meridian Casket Works had been bought in April by a manufacturing group out of Omaha. She had known that. Everybody in Platte County had known that. What she had not known was that the new ownership had spent the spring reviewing what they called ancillary material streams. That a hardwood dealer out of Missouri had approached them in May with an offer to take the entire reject volume on a commercial basis, sight unseen, hauled at the dealer's expense, paid by the ton. The reject pile was no longer going to farmers. The last load to her gate would go out in August. She stood in the kitchen with the receiver in her hand, doing the mathematics that a person does automatically in a moment like that. 3 cords in the barn at various stages of drying. 4 customers with orders on the books running into the following spring. A price structure, a reputation, a 5-year note at the First National, every bit of it resting on wood that came from one place, that had come from that one place since 1971, that was going to stop coming in 5 weeks. She thanked him. She almost let him go. Then something in the way he was breathing made her hold on. She asked him who the dealer was. He gave her the name of a hardwood outfit in Joplin, Missouri, then went quiet for a moment. Then he told her the rest of it. Because he was 64 years old, he had liked her grandfather. He was not going to carry it around. The Joplin outfit was not an unknown. He had pulled the file after the contract came through, the way a yard foreman does. They had one large standing account that took the bulk of everything they brokered north of the Missouri River, an accessories manufacturer, Minneapolis. Might mean nothing. His voice thinned down 14 miles of copper. Companies buy wood. She looked out the window at the gate. She got in the truck and drove to Columbus that afternoon, not because there was anything to be done, but because she had to see the yard with her own eyes. The reject stack was in the same corner it had occupied since before she was born. It was already smaller than it should have been in July. There was a flatbed there she did not recognize, Missouri plates, a driver with a clipboard walking the pile, with the particular boredom of a man buying by weight who does not care what he is looking at. She stood at the fence for 10 minutes. She watched a slab go into the truck with a crotch figure in it that she could read from 30 feet away, wood that would have made a top-tier blank, wood that was going to be sold by the ton to somebody who would run it through a chipper or cut it into pen blanks. That was the moment it stopped being business. The second blow came on the 11th of September, which she remembered because it was the day she pulled the last of the beans. Merle Ferreter called at 8 in the evening. He was a direct man who had never once opened a conversation with Weather, so when he started that call with Weather, she set down the coffee she had just poured. He was canceling his standing order, 12 pieces, scheduled through the following June. He gave her 3 sentences of business reason before he ran out of them. Then he told her the truth, because he was not built for the other thing. He had been at a show in Denver over Labor Day. A man from an accessories company had spent 20 minutes with him at the booth, friendly, well-informed, and in the course of that 20 minutes had mentioned, with regret, that the Nebraska source everybody was excited about had lost her material stream in the spring, that the Casket contract had gone commercial, that she had perhaps 2 years of inventory and no pipeline, that it was a shame because the wood was genuinely good. He had said it the way a man says something he wishes were not true. He had said it to at least 4 other people that weekend. She stood there with the phone against her ear, looking at her own reflection in the black kitchen window. Merle. Her voice came out level, which she was proud of for the rest of her life. Is it true that I lost the casket works? Yes. Is it true I don't have a pipeline? The pause on the other end was long enough to be an admission of something. Vance called her 4 days after that. He did not cancel. He did something worse in its way, which was to reduce his order from 18 to 9 for the following year, then explain himself with the same brutal courtesy he had used on her price in 1987. He had 6 rifles on his own books that depended on her wood. He could not commit a customer's deposit to a blank he might not receive. He told her that if she came out the other side of it, he would go back to 18, that he would go to 24, that he was not moving to another supplier, that he was simply not going to promise a man in Colorado something she might not be able to give him. Then he told her the part she needed. The fellow from Minneapolis called my shop in August, a door shut somewhere in Arizona. Wanted to know if I'd be interested in a stable domestic source, given the situation in Nebraska. He knew about the Casket contract 2 months before you did. She sat down on the floor of her own kitchen, with her back against the cabinet and stayed there for a while. Here is what it cost her. In the plain numbers she wrote on the legal pad that night, because writing numbers was the only thing that ever settled her hands. 68% of her contracted revenue for 1991. Gone in 11 days. 3 cords of walnut in the barn, which sounded like plenty until you understood that a cord of offcuts yields maybe a dozen usable top-tier blanks after drying loss, splitting loss. The pieces that turn out to be lying about what they are. 14 months of production at most, with nothing behind it. A 5-year note with a payment due in January. A brother in Omaha who would say the word auctioneer inside of one phone call if she gave him the opening. She did not call Nels. She did not call Vance back. She did not that week do anything at all except farm, because the beans were still coming out. She thought about it for 2 days, which was how her grandfather had done everything. Sitting still while other men were already moving. What she came out of those 2 days with was a single question, put to herself in the barn on a Thursday morning with the flashlight off and the doors open. Why had the Casket Works ever been the only place? There was no answer. That was the whole discovery. Meridian had been first. Meridian had been free. Meridian had arrived without effort in 1971 when a foreman with a pencil made a phone call, and for 19 years 2 generations of Lindqvists had never looked past it because they had never needed to. It was not a supply chain. It was a habit that had been mistaken for a supply chain by everybody who touched it, including the man from Minneapolis, who had gone to the trouble of cutting a rope he assumed was the only rope in the building. She got the plat book, a Nebraska road map, a legal pad. She drew a circle 150 miles out from her own gate. Inside that circle, there were furniture manufacturers in Norfolk, Fremont, Grand Island. There were millwork operations in Wahoo, Seward, Hastings. There were stair builders, cabinet shops, flooring outfits, 2 casket operations she had never thought about because they were small, a company in Kearney that made church pews. Every one of those places bought hardwood by the truckload. Every one of them graded it on arrival. Every one of them had a corner of the building where the pieces that failed went to wait for somebody to haul them off. She left on the 1st of October in a truck with a full tank, a thermos, $300 in cash, a folder of photographs, 4 finished blanks on the passenger seat. She was gone, off and on, for 3 weeks. The first shop she walked into, a cabinet operation on the east edge of Norfolk. The man at the front desk assumed she was there about an invoice. She asked to see whoever handled the scrap. She got taken back through the building to a bay where a foreman, with sawdust in his eyebrows, was running a wide belt sander, told him what she wanted, watched his face do the thing that every one of those men's faces did over the following 3 weeks, which was to move from confusion through suspicion into something that looked almost like embarrassment. He walked her out back. There was a dumpster half full of walnut. She climbed in. She spent 40 minutes in a dumpster behind a cabinet shop in Norfolk, Nebraska, in October, pulling out pieces, holding them to the light, setting the good ones on the tailgate of her truck, while the foreman stood there, watching a woman in her grandfather's coat treat his garbage like it was worth something. When she got out, she had 13 usable slabs, 2 of which were better than anything she had received from Meridian in a year. He asked her what she was going to do with it. She showed him the blanks off the passenger seat. He held one up, turned it, then turned it the other way, then went very quiet, then asked her how long they had been throwing that wood out. She told him she did not know, that she had only been throwing hers out for the first 4 years. That was the pattern in every town. Nobody hid anything from her. Nobody drove a bargain. What she met, over 3 weeks, in 14 buildings, was a kind of institutional blindness, so complete it had a physical location in every plant, the corner where the wood went. Men who had spent 20 years in hardwood, who could tell you the moisture content of a load off the truck to within 2%, who had never once looked at a rejected piece as anything but a disposal cost, because the piece had failed the only test their building was set up to run. The pew plant in Kearney nearly threw her out. The plant manager was a heavy man in his 50s who had been told by his front office that a woman was in the lobby asking about scrap, who came out annoyed, who informed her that the company did not sell material, did not broker material, was not in the lumber business. She asked him one question instead of arguing. She asked what he did with a board that came in with a crotch in it. He told her they cut around it. She asked what happened to the part they cut around. He stood there for a second with his mouth slightly open, then walked her out to the trim bin at the end of the rip line, and the two of them looked down into 18 inches of black walnut that his company had been paying a hauler $9 a yard to remove twice a month since 1984. She reached in, came up with a piece the length of her forearm, turned it over. Under the sawdust, the grain rolled like a river seen from an airplane. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he asked her, in a completely different voice, whether she was telling him he had been paying a man to take that away. She told him yes, but that it was not his fault, that his building was built to reject it, that a plant is a machine for finding one kind of wood, that everything the machine rejects becomes invisible to everyone standing inside it. 5 of the shops told her to take whatever she wanted free, that she would be doing them a favor on the hauling. 2 of them wanted to be paid, which she preferred, because a transaction has a memory that a favor does not. So, she named a figure low enough to protect her margin, high enough that the number felt real on their end. One outfit in Hastings had a standing arrangement with a mulch company and could not break it. 2 never called her back. When she came back down her own lane on the 23rd of October, she had 11 active sources inside the circle. 7 of them under some kind of standing arrangement, 4 of them wanting a call before each pickup. Meridian had been one source moving 2 cords every 6 to 8 weeks. The 11 together moved more than that, out of a wider geography, off different trees, with more variety in the figure than she had seen in her life. She sat in the truck in her own driveway, with the engine ticking, and let herself feel it for exactly the length of one cigarette she did not smoke. Then she went inside, and because she wanted to write the 11 names down somewhere permanent, she went to the front room, opened the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk, took out the third ledger. She turned to the first blank page past his 40. Then she stopped, went back, read the 40 pages properly for the first time since February of 1987, when she had been looking for a letter, not a list. Norfolk, Fremont, Grand Island, Wahoo, Seward, Hastings, Kearney. 7 of the shops she had just spent 3 weeks finding were already in that book, in her grandfather's small, careful hand, with notes beside them about what species they ran, dated between 1979 and 1983. She sat down on the floor, in the same spot where she had read Rennick's letter 3 years earlier. He had done the work. He had gotten in his truck sometime around 1979, after a letter from Oregon told him what he had, driven the same roads she had just driven, walked into the same buildings, talked to men who were probably the fathers of the men she had talked to, written it all down. Then he had come home, put the ledger in the drawer, gone out to the barn to stack another season, gone on receiving free wood from a casket factory for another 7 years, gone on selling nothing to nobody, gone on being the best walnut man in the state of Nebraska, in a building where no one could see him. She said it to the empty room quietly, with more grief in it than anger. You built the whole road. You just never got in the truck. She got up off the floor and wrote the names on the first blank page after his 40, in her own hand, which had never been as neat as his. The first pickup started in November. By Christmas, she had a cord and a half stacked in the barn from 6 different buildings. She stickered it, dated it, entered it in the ledger with the source noted, then went into 1991 with the first real feeling of safety she had experienced since Prosser's phone call in July. That feeling lasted until the 11th of February. She had started cutting the new material in January, working from the pieces that had come in first, which had been sitting through the wettest part of the fall in an unheated bay behind a furniture plant in Fremont before she ever picked them up. She cut 19 blanks out of that lot over 5 weeks, oversized, stacked them on the racks the way she had stacked wood her entire adult life. She walked into the shop on a Monday morning in the second week of February, a morning that had come in at 9 below, after 4 days above 40, put her hand on the stove to check it, then looked up at the rack. The first one she picked up had a check running from the butt end 11 inches into the grain. The second one had 2. She went through all 19, standing at the rack in her coat, with the stove cold behind her. 11 were ruined outright, wood she would not have sold to a man she disliked. 6 had movement she could work around, only by cutting the blank down to a size that made it a different product at a lower price. 2 were fine. 19 blanks, 2 survivors. 6 weeks of evenings. She stood there and did the only thing available, which was to figure out what she had done wrong, since the wood had not done anything except behave exactly the way its own history told it to. It took her the rest of February to understand it. Working with a moisture meter, she drove to Grand Island to buy with money she did not have. The Meridian wood had come off a yard where hardwood was stacked outdoors under cover, air-dried, handled by men who cared about it for reasons of production. Every load that reached her gate for 19 years had arrived with essentially the same history, so her whole method, the 2 years per inch, the racking pattern, the timing, every instinct in her hands had been calibrated to one drying, history without her ever knowing that was what she had been calibrated to. The Fremont wood had come out of a heated plant, cut off boards that had been through a commercial kiln, then thrown into an unheated bay for 11 weeks. It had case-hardened. The outside was dry and the inside was not. The stresses locked in against each other, and the first hard temperature swing after she opened up the interior with a saw released all of it at once. The Norfolk material had a different history again. The Seward shop ran wood from 3 suppliers, which meant 3 histories inside 1 dumpster. 11 sources. 11 educations. Every one of them costing her blanks. There is a thing that happens to a person in the 4th month of a stretch like that, which is that the work stops being a matter of confidence entirely. She got up. She drove. She hauled. She cut test pieces off every load before she cut a single blank, split them, weighed them, dried the samples in the oven in her own kitchen at 215 degrees, weighed them again, wrote the numbers in the ledger. She built a rack system with 3 zones in the barn. She stopped working from her hands and started working from paper, which she hated, which she did anyway, for 4 months. The pickup routes ran through the whole of that winter, which was the part nobody ever heard about afterward. 14 buildings on a rotation, she worked out with a roadmap and a fuel budget. 3 of them 90 minutes out. 1 of them past Kearney. All of them expecting her on a particular week. She drove a 2-wheel drive truck through February on county roads that had not seen a blade since the storm before. She loaded by hand, alone in loading docks where men in coveralls stood around a barrel fire, watching a woman throw walnut over a tailgate in the dark. Twice that winter she got stuck. Once outside Wahoo, she sat in a ditch for 4 hours until a man with a tractor came by, then paid him $20 he did not want to take. She stopped in a truck stop in Grand Island one night in March, sat at the counter with a cup of coffee at 9:40 in the evening, 4 hours from being home, and looked at her own hands on the counter. Split across the knuckles, 1 thumbnail black, a burn on the back of the right one from a stove door. 29 years old. A woman at the register asked if she was a nurse coming off shift because of the hands. There was one night that same month when she came close to ending it. She had opened a blank that afternoon that she had been sure of, the best piece off the Seward material, 40 hours into it, a stock she had been building in her head since January. The check came out of the underside 3 inches ahead of the draw knife, quiet, no sound at all, the way the bad ones always went. She set the tool down. She walked out of the shop, crossed the yard, sat at the kitchen table in her coat with the lights off, then got the folder out of the desk and put Merrick's card on the table in front of her. $210 a unit, $300 a year, $63,000, guaranteed from a company with a warehouse, a marketing department, a hauling contract, a purchasing agent who would call her once a month and never once ask her to gamble 40 hours on a piece of wood with a secret inside it. She sat with that card until the yard light came on. What kept her at the table was not courage. It was a smaller, more useful thing. She realized she could not describe, even to herself, what she would do on the 2nd Tuesday of an ordinary month under that arrangement. She would go to the barn. She would find wood that matched a sentence somebody had written in Minneapolis. She would put the pieces that did not match back on the rack, where they would sit until they were firewood, because there would be no one left buying the other kind. She put the card back in the folder. She went out to the shop, swept it, then cut a test coupon off the next Seward slab, split it, weighed it, wrote the number down. Nels drove out in April, unannounced, on a Sunday. He had heard enough in 3 phone calls to work out what was happening. He sat in the kitchen, then said what he had driven 4 hours to say, which was that he had $11,000 in a savings account doing nothing, that he was offering it at no interest with no schedule, that she was his sister. She thanked him. Then she told him no. He wanted a reason. She gave him the true one instead of the polite one. If she took it, she told him, then the day she finally got this figured out, some part of her would always know the operation had been carried across by somebody who did not believe in it. He had offered her money in 1987 to quit. He was offering money now to keep going. Both offers came from the same place, which was a man who could not stand to watch, and she loved him for it, and she was going to do this with her own hands or not at all. He got angry. He got over it by the time he reached the highway. He called her every Sunday for the next year, which was worth more than the $11,000. By June of 1991, she had lost 31 blanks to the learning. She sold the tractor in April. She bought a smaller one, 19 years old, with a loader that did not work, out of a farm sale near Cedar Rapids and put the difference against the January note, plus the moisture meter, plus the fuel for a year of monthly pickup routes. She ate out of the freezer. She let the insurance on the truck go to liability. In May, she took a dozen of the 31 ruined blanks, cut them down into pen blanks and knife scales, sold the lot to a hobby dealer in Lincoln for $460, which she recorded in the ledger in a column she made for it, because her grandfather had never had a column for salvage. Ostrander in Kansas City carried her through the worst of it without ever knowing he was doing it. He took 19 pieces that spring, paid inside 2 weeks every time. Vance took his 9, then wrote in June, asking whether she wanted to go back up to 18 for the following year, which she did. Hollenbeck in Pennsylvania sent a check in advance in March for 4 pieces he did not need until autumn, with a note that said he had been in business 22 years, that he knew what a supply year looked like from the inside, that she was not to consider it a favor because he intended to collect the wood. She wrote all 3 of those men into the ledger by name that summer with the date beside it, in a section that had nothing to do with lumber. The first blanks, off the corrected system, came out of the barn in August of 1991. She cut 4, all from the Norfolk material, all of them stickered under the new zone method, with recorded numbers behind them. She let them sit 3 weeks instead of 3 days. She checked them, found nothing. She cut 9 more in September. Nothing. In October, she opened up a slab that had come out of the pew plant in Kearney, wood off a tree that had grown on a creek bank somewhere in Buffalo County, and found underneath the gray, weathered face the deepest fiddleback figure she had ever cut in her life, running the correct direction through the wrist, 12 inches of it, clean. She stood in the shop with that piece under the single wall lamp for a long time. She was 30 years old. She had been at this since she was 12, and it was the first time she had held wood in her hands that she knew, with no reference to anybody, was better than anything her grandfather had ever worked. She called Vance. She told him what she had. She named a price of $600, which was 90 more than she had ever asked for a single blank. He took it without negotiating, then told her to raise her top tier across the board. Her gross for 1991 was $28,400, which was $11,000 less than 1989 and represented the worst business year she would ever have. She counted it as the year she stopped being somebody's granddaughter with a good eye. By February of 1992, she had 14 sources, 3 of them new, one of them a walnut buyer in Columbus, who had started calling her when unusual material came through, because he had decided she was the only person in the state who would pay for the strange pieces. Her racks held 4.5 cords under a system she could explain to another human being. Her lead time was out to 7 months. She had put the price to $390 standard. The envelope came on a Thursday in the second week of that month. She pulled it out of the box at the end of the lane with the seed catalogs, drove up to the house, set the mail on the kitchen table, went out to do chores. It was still there when she came in at dark. Cream stock, heavier than a bill. Her name typed rather than written. A return address in the corner, printed, a logo she had last seen stitched over man's heart in her own shop 2 years before. She poured coffee. She sat down across from it. The house made its winter noises. Out past the window, the yard light came on over a barn, with 4.5 cords of other people's garbage racked and dated inside it. She did not open it that night. She opened it Friday morning at the kitchen table with a paring knife, because the flap was glued down too well to tear. There were 3 sheets inside. The first was a letter, 2 paragraphs, signed by Von Merrick, cordial, in the way of a man who has decided that the last conversation never happened. The company was proceeding with its premium line. They regretted that a supply relationship had not been possible. They wished her continued success. The second sheet was the reason for the envelope. It was a consulting proposal, $12,000, paid in 2 installments, for what the document called a technical advisory engagement. A written description of her grading criteria, her drying protocols, her source classification method, plus 2 days of her time at their facility in Minneapolis. The wording was careful. She was not being asked to sell anything. She was being asked to explain it. The third sheet was a confidentiality agreement, with her name already typed in the blank. She read the whole thing twice, then a third time slowly, the way a person reads something they already understand, but cannot yet believe they understand. $12,000 in February of 1992 was the difference between a hard year and an ordinary one. It was the January note twice over. It was a used tractor with a working loader. It did not require her to give up a customer, ship a single blank, alter one thing about how she worked. She sat with it until the coffee went cold, then walked out to the barn, turned on the lights over the 3 drying zones, stood in front of a rack of 41 pieces she had personally cut, weighed, dated, argued with, waited on. Every one of them had a number on the end grain in her own handwriting. What they wanted was not $12,000 worth of information. It was 19 years of a man's evenings, 4 months of ruined blanks, a stool in front of a piece of wood. When she was 12 years old, a moisture meter bought with money she did not have. All of it compressed onto paper, in her own words, priced like a week of consulting, because that was what it looked like from an office. She wrote her answer that night on a single sheet. She thanked him for the offer. She declined it. She added one line at the bottom, which she thought about for a long time before she put it down, because it was more than the situation required. A person can buy the answers. Nobody has ever figured out how to buy the 20 years of being wrong that produced them. She mailed it Saturday. She did not think about it again for 2 years, which was exactly the amount of rope she had handed over without knowing it. 1992 came in better than the year before it, which was not a high standard. She built 91 blanks. She held the price at $390, then moved it in September to $420 because the lead time had gone past 9 months, which is the market telling you something in the only language it has. Ostrander took 26. Vance went back to 18, then wrote in November asking for 22. Ferreter called in April, 18 months after canceling, and did not apologize, which she respected more than an apology. He asked whether she had room for him. She told him she had a 9-month wait like everybody else. He took the 9 months. In 1993, she quit farming the row ground entirely. She kept the 100 acres of hay, rented the rest to the Halverson place on a cash lease that came in twice a year, sold the planter, sold the combine at a sale in Norfolk, where she stood in the crowd on the buying side of it, for the first time in her life. She was 32 years old. She had been raised to believe that a Lindqvist who sold a combine had failed at something. Standing there, watching it go, all she felt was the specific relief of a woman putting down a suitcase she has been carrying up a stairway for 6 years. Her gross from wood that year was $51,400. August Rennick died in Roseburg in November of 1993. At 76, 3 weeks, after mailing her a package she did not open until after the notice reached her. Inside it were 2 things: a checkering cradle he had built in 1961, worn smooth at the clamp, plus a single sheet in his hand saying he had no children in the trade, that a tool ought to go where it will be used, that she was not to write back thanking him because he would rather not have that particular letter sitting on his desk. She put the cradle on the south bench. She used it for the next 30 years. She never did write the letter, which she counted afterward as the only instruction from an older person she had ever obeyed exactly. She got Merrick's catalog in the second week of March 1994. In a padded envelope from Kansas City, with a note from Lemuel Ostrander clipped to the front cover that read, "You need to see page 11. The line was called Heritage Plains Walnut. The cover photograph was a stack of rough slabs, shot in low side light on what looked like a barn floor. The copy on the inside front described American black walnut, recovered from regional manufacturing operations across the Los Central Plains. Wood that had been rejected by industry for the very characteristics that made it exceptional. Page 4 described the relationship between crowded growth, wind stress, injury, competition for light on riverbanks, the way a tree's history writes itself into the figure. Page 7 described slow air drying, The 2-year per inch rule. Why a kiln flattens color. Page 11 was the grading system. 4 tiers. Her grandfather's 4 tiers. In order, with the criteria described accurately enough that she could have used the page to train somebody. The numbers were gone. They had names now. Field, hedgerow, riverbreak, provenance. The last one was for wood with the figure running correctly through the wrist, which he had been told about in her shop, at her bench, with a piece in her hand, on the 19th of March, 1990. She sat on the porch step with the catalog open in the cold, reading her own working life described in the past tense by a marketing department. Nothing in it was a lie. That was the part that took the ground out from under her. He had not stolen a photograph, had not used her name, had not claimed her wood. He had taken a way of seeing that 2 generations of one family had built in a shop behind a house in Boone County, then printed it on glossy stock in Minneapolis, with a registered trademark symbol beside the line name. Ostrander's note had a second sentence on the back that she did not see until she flipped it over. They quoted me $240 a blank last month. She drove to Columbus on the 22nd of March to see a lawyer, the only one she had ever spoken to. A man who had handled her grandfather's estate. He was in his 60s, careful, honest to the point of discomfort. He read the catalog cover to cover with a pencil in his hand. He asked her whether she had a written agreement with Merrick. She told him no. He asked whether she had ever published her grading criteria in a catalog, a letter, an advertisement. She told him no. He asked whether her grandfather had. No. He asked whether the criteria appeared anywhere outside 3 cloth-bound ledgers in a farmhouse. They did not. He set the pencil down. What he told her then took about 4 minutes, in plain language, without cushioning. Information that has never been protected in writing is not protected by having been true first. A method is not a name. A way of grading wood is not a recipe locked in a safe. The trademark application covered a phrase describing a region, which was contestable, which would cost her between $40,000 and $90,000 to contest, with a real chance of losing on the merits, a certainty of losing 3 years to it. Then he told her the last part, which she wrote down in the truck afterward because she wanted it in her own handwriting. That in 31 years of practice, he had watched a great many small operators destroy themselves, proving they were right about something they were right about. She asked him whether there was anything at all. He told her there was one thing that could not be applied for, registered or bought, which was that they had the description of the wood while she had the wood. Nels drove out from Omaha on the first Saturday in April. He had heard about it from her in a phone call she had cut short, then had spent 2 weeks in a state she recognized from childhood, which was her brother being angry on somebody else's behalf with nowhere to put it. He came into the kitchen, put the catalog on the table, sat down across from her. He wanted to know the number to fight it. She gave him the lawyer's range. He did the arithmetic out loud, which was a habit from his job, then stopped in the middle of it because the arithmetic answered itself. He asked how much of it was hers. She told him the truth, that the wood knowledge was Halvor's, that the 4 tiers were Halvor's, that the only original thing in that catalog belonging to her personally was the phrase about a plant being a machine for finding one kind of wood, which she had said to a plant manager in Kearney, not to Merrick. So at least that one they had arrived at independently. Nels sat with his hands flat on her grandfather's table. Then he asked the question that turned out to be the only useful thing anybody said to her that entire spring. So what are you going to do? Not what are you going to do about it? He had enough sense to leave those 2 words out. She thought about it for a while. Then she got up, took her coat off the hook, told him to come out to the barn. She walked him down the 3 drying zones with the lights on, showed him the coupons split off every load, the moisture numbers in the ledger, the dates, the sources, the failures in a column with no excuses beside them. She showed him a rack of 9 pieces from the Pew plant in Kearney that had come off one tree on one creek bank in Buffalo County. No 2 of them alike, every one of them impossible to specify in advance, in any sentence a marketing department could write. Then she told him what she was going to do, which was nothing at all, in the sense he meant it. They printed the map. She pulled a slab off the rack, turned it into the light. Let them go find the country. She built 119 blanks in 1994 and raised her top tier to $540. The Heritage Plains line shipped first units that August, sourced through the Joplin dealer, cut from commercial walnut off the general market. She saw one at a show in Lincoln the following spring. A competent stock, dimensionally consistent, sanded well, finished in something sprayed. The wood was straight-grained, uniform, quiet, the color flat, exactly the material that any building set up to reject figure produces when it goes looking for 100 pieces that match each other. It cost $395. Beside it on the same table lay a rifle a builder in Iowa had put together on one of her blanks 2 years earlier, which is the only reason she saw the two of them within 4 feet of each other. Nobody at that table had to be told which was which. 2 men stopped, looked at both, then picked up the Iowa rifle. One of them asked the builder where the wood had come from. She stood 8 feet away, holding a paper cup of coffee, listening to a stranger explain her own operation to another stranger, which is the exact moment a name stops being something a person can grant you. That same spring, a man drove down from Bismarck without calling, walked into her yard at 7 in the morning on a Saturday, stood in the shop for 2 hours asking questions, then wrote a check for a piece she had not offered him, because it was not for sale yet. She told him it needed another year on the rack. He told her he had waited 9 years to find a source. He could wait 1 more. That was the first time she understood that the lead time had stopped being an apology. Her lead time hit 11 months in the fall of 1995. Her gross was $78,000. She stopped taking new customers in October, then reopened in December because she could not make herself do it. She was working 60-hour weeks alone in a building her grandfather had put up out of a fallen barn, on wood collected off 14 loading docks, with a waiting list that had names on it from 19 states. The order came in February of 1996. A builder in Colorado named Whitcomb Shea had been hired to produce a matched run of rifles for the centennial of a hunting club in the Gunnison country. 40 guns, 1 per founding family, delivered over 18 months, every one of them to carry wood from a single source with documentation of origin. He had seen her material on 3 rifles built by other men. He called her in January, drove out in February, spent a full day in the barn. 40 blanks. Top tier or better, all of them. At her price, which by then was $540, it was $21,600, the largest single contract of her life, with half down. She took the deposit in March. She spent the spring pulling material, working exclusively out of 2 sources she trusted most, a furniture plant in Fremont that had rebuilt its dry room in 1993, plus the Carney Pew operation. She cut the first 12 blanks in June, the next 14 in July, the last 14 in August, working nights straight through the hay season. By the first week of September, she had all 40 stickered in Zone 2, checked, numbered. 3 weeks from crating. She found it on the 9th of September, on a Monday. Doing the routine she had built 5 years earlier out of 31 ruined blanks and a moisture meter. She pulled the reference coupons for the June material, the split samples she kept from every load, weighed them dry, then went back through the ledger to compare against the intake numbers. The Fremont figures did not sit right. They were not wrong enough to fail anything. They were 4 points off where they should have been at that stage, in a direction she had seen exactly once before, in February of 1991, in 19 blanks on a 9 below morning. She drove to Fremont that afternoon. The plant had changed its dry room contractor in April. The new outfit ran a faster schedule at a higher final temperature, which was better for the plant, which shortened their turn time by 2 days a load. Nobody there had thought to mention it to the woman, who came once a month for the trim bin, because nobody there had any reason to believe it mattered to a person hauling away scrap. She stood in that parking lot doing the mathematics in her head. Case hardening in a stress-relieved board is not a defect you can see. 26 of the 40 blanks were Fremont material. They would inlet clean. They would finish beautifully. They would go on to 40 rifles in the Gunnison country in the hands of 40 families. Then they would spend a winter at 8,000 feet. Then another one. Then somewhere in the second or third year, a percentage of them, maybe a quarter, maybe more, would open a check along the underside of the wrist. She would not be there when it happened. That was the whole of it. She would be in Nebraska. The failures would arrive one at a time over 4 or 5 years in shops all over Colorado. In a run of matched rifles built for a centennial, every one of them documented as coming from a single source. She went home. She did not sleep that night either. What she wanted, on the drive back, was to ship them. She let herself want it out loud in the truck cab with the windows up, because she had learned by 35 that a thing you refuse to admit you want will run you from underneath. $21,600. A finished contract. A builder who would tell 40 wealthy families where the wood came from. A quarter chance of failure, which is another way of saying a 3/4 chance that nobody ever knows anything. She sat at the kitchen table on the 10th, with the ledger open to 1991 and the salvage column her grandfather never had. Then she wrote the letters, 22 of them, one to every customer with wood on her books, cut from Fremont material since April, plus Shea in Colorado, plus 4 men who had already taken delivery in July on pieces from the same lot. She did not soften it. She described the change at the plant, the reference numbers, what case hardening does, what she believed the risk was, what she did not know. She offered every one of them a full refund, replacement at her cost 8 months out, or the wood as it stood with a written statement of the risk, their choice. The 4 July men, she offered replacements to outright, at no charge, shipped when ready. She called Shea before the letter reached him, because a man who has 40 families waiting deserves a voice instead of an envelope. It was the hardest telephone call of her working life. She told him she could not deliver in October. She told him she could deliver 26 replacement blanks the following June out of the Kearney material. That she would hold the price where it was. That she was returning his deposit that week, regardless of what he decided. There was a long silence in Colorado. Then he asked her a question with an edge on it, which was whether she was certain or whether she was being careful because being careful was cheaper than being wrong in public. She did not get angry. I'm not certain, her hand flat on the ledger. That's the reason. If I were certain they'd fail, this would be an easy morning. He pulled the order. He was decent about it. He was also 61 years old with a centennial on a calendar. So he went to another supplier that fall. 2 other customers left. One of them wrote back a page explaining that a man in business cannot work with a supplier who reschedules on a theory. She returned $19,400 in deposits between the 12th of September and the end of October, which took every dollar of operating cash she had, plus a short note against the hay ground that the First National wrote without much discussion. Because by then she had 6 years of history with them. The Forton Kearney blanks out of the Shea run, the sound ones, she sold to Ostrander in Kansas City at her cost, no margin, delivered inside a week, because cost money in October was worth more to her than full price in June. She burned the 26 blanks in November. Not all at once. She fed them into the shop stove over about 3 weeks, 2 or 3 in evening, working on other things while they went, because there was no version of selling them that did not put them on a rifle somewhere. The 11th one she could not do for about 40 minutes. It was Fremont material, off a tree, with a lightning scar in it, the best piece in the lot, figure running up out of the flat in a long, slow wave that she had spent 9 hours shaping in July. She stood in front of the open stove door with it in both hands, thinking about a hobby dealer in Lincoln, who bought seconds by the box, about the fact that a knife scale never gets cold at 8,000 feet, about how easily she could cut this thing into 40 small, honest pieces that would never fail anybody. Then she thought about a man opening a crate in the Gunnison country in 2001, with her name on the packing slip. She put it in end first. She stood there while it caught. The figure came up under the flame the way it comes up under oil. One time, for about 4 seconds, brighter than she had ever seen it. Then it was just wood burning in a stove in a shop in Nebraska. Bertrand Hollenbeck's reply came on the 29th of September. It was 4 lines long. It said he would take the risk statement option on his 2 pieces, that he had been building for 27 years, that in that time he had received exactly 1 letter of this kind from any supplier of anything. What he did not tell her was that he had photocopied her letter, then mailed it to a man he had known for a decade, who wrote for a national magazine. The writer called her in the first week of October, 1996. He wanted to come out. She told him she was not interested in publicity. He told her he had a copy of a letter in front of him that a woman had sent to 22 customers, destroying her own largest order on a 4-point moisture discrepancy, that he had spent 19 years covering that trade, that he had never seen anything like it, that he was going to write about it, whether she cooperated or not, so she could either sit in her own kitchen for 2 days or read someone else's version of her in March. She let him come. He spent 2 days in the shop that November. He watched her cut coupons. He read the ledgers with permission, all 3 volumes, including the 40 pages of shop names in a dead man's handwriting. He asked her about the catalog from Minneapolis, which he had seen. She told him she had no comment on another company's line, which he printed exactly that way, which did more damage to Merrick than anything she could have said. The piece ran in the March 1997 issue under the title "The Woman Who Burned the Order." It described her material, her sources, her method, her prices, her lead time, which was 13 months by the time it printed. It described the Fremont discovery in detail. It included 9 photographs, 2 of them of pieces so figured that 4 readers wrote to the magazine insisting the images had been retouched, which they had not been. The last paragraph quoted the line from her letter to the 22, the only thing she was quoted saying in the entire article. "I would rather you wait 8 months than have this wood embarrass both of us in front of your customer in 2001. She got 147 letters in the 6 weeks after that issue reached subscribers. She answered every one by hand, which took her through most of April, working at the kitchen table after dark with the ledger open beside her. 23 of them turned into orders. Her lead time went from 13 months to 21. Tobias Renner showed up in the 2nd week of May. He was 19 years old, from a place 9 miles south of hers, tall in the way of a boy who has not filled in yet, with the article folded in his back pocket. He had graduated in 1995, had been working at the elevator, had read the piece 3 times. He stood in the shop door with his hands hanging, then asked whether she needed help. She asked him what he knew about wood. "Nothing," he told her. Then he corrected himself, because he was honest before he was anything else. His grandmother had a walnut table he had looked at his whole life, without knowing why he kept looking at it. She put him on the stool at the north bench, laid a piece of Buffalo County crotch material in front of him, told him to sit there. He asked her what she wanted him to do with it. She heard her grandfather come out of her own mouth, word for word, with the same weight taken off it. "Look at it." He lasted 3 days. On the 3rd evening, he came to find her with the slab held out in both hands, his thumb resting on the underside where the wood changed its mind, then asked whether the crack would start there. She hired him at $6 an hour. The Meridian Casket Works closed in October of 1998. The Omaha Group consolidated production to a plant in Iowa. The buildings on the Columbus site went dark. The lumber sheds emptied. The yard where a reject pile had sat in one corner since 1971 swept and posted. Wendell Prosser, who was 72, took a package worth 9 months of pay after 29 years, then went to work part-time at a hardware store on 26th Street because his wife told him he could not sit in the house. The Heritage Plains Walnut line was quietly discontinued the same year. It had run 4 seasons. It had never done what it was built to do, because the market Von Merrick had described as too small to sustain a business, turned out to be precisely the size it needed to be. The buyers in it knew wood. They would pay $2,000 for a rifle stock without blinking. They would not pay $395 for a wrapper with a story printed on it. A premium package containing ordinary material is a proposition that works exactly once per customer. She heard about the discontinuation from Ostrander, who heard it from a distributor, who heard it from a rep clearing inventory at 40% off. She did not feel anything about it that she could name. She was 37 years old, working with one employee in a shop with a 21-month wait, cutting the best wood she had ever handled. The catalog was in a drawer in the front room under the tax records. She had not looked at page 11 since 1994. Von Merrick called her on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1999. She knew the voice before he gave his name. It had changed some. The frictionless quality was gone out of it, which she found she disliked more than she expected, because it had been easier to hold a grudge against a man who sounded like a brochure. He was no longer with the Minneapolis company. He had left in the spring of that year, then started his own outfit out of a leased building in Bloomington, doing accessories at first, moving now towards small batch stock work for shops in 3 states. He had 4 builders lined up. He needed wood. He asked whether she would sell to him. Greta stood at the wall phone in the kitchen, with Toby out in the shop, running the bandsaw, the sound of it coming across the yard. 21 years old that year, cutting his own blanks under her numbers. Yes, she told him. She sold to anybody who paid the price, respected the lead time, took the piece that came. He asked her what the price was. $520 for standard. $750 for the top tier. Lead time 22 months, deposit half down, no specifications accepted on figure. The silence on the other end went on long enough that she could hear a fluorescent ballast humming somewhere in Bloomington, Minnesota. Then he told her that was a considerable increase over what they had discussed. It is. She looked out the window at the barn. In 1990, you brought me research that said, this market was too small to hold what I was building. I stayed in it anyway. She let that sit exactly as long as he had let his own pauses sit in her kitchen 9 years earlier. This is what too small looks like now. He did not argue. He asked whether she took payment by wire or by check. He ordered 20 pieces. He paid the deposit in 8 days. He never once mentioned the catalog, the consulting proposal, the phone calls he had made to Denver in the fall of 1990. So she never mentioned them either, since she had decided by then that a man who has to buy his wood from you at market price every year is a man who has already been told. He bought from her, at her number, for the next 12 years. Toby came in from the shop that evening, wanting to know who had been on the phone so long. She told him. He was 21. He had read the March 1997 article until it came apart at the folds. He knew the whole history the way a young man knows a story he arrived too late for, so he wanted to know why she had not made the man crawl a little. She thought about how to answer that, since it mattered. Because he already did. She hung the receiver back on its hook. A man who has to write me a check every year at my price, for wood he told me wasn't worth making, is a man who apologizes 20 times, without ever having to open his mouth. If I'd said one word about 1990, I'd have traded 20 apologies for one. She started teaching him the grading system in earnest that winter, which was a different thing from teaching him to cut. Cutting she could correct. A boy who takes too much off a comb has made a mistake you can see, measure, discuss. Grading is a decision made in the first 4 seconds, alone, with nobody watching, about whether a piece of wood deserves the next 2 years of a rack it will occupy. Get that wrong often enough and the whole operation silts up with material that will never be worth what it costs to keep. She did it the way it had been done to her, which was slowly, in the dark months, with the stove going. 2 pieces on the bench, 1 lamp, no talking. Which one? Why? She let him be wrong without correcting him for a full winter. Because a person who is told the answer forgets it by spring, while a person who commits to a wrong answer in front of somebody they respect never forgets the moment they found out. In February of 2000, he graded a piece down 2 tiers that she would have called top. She asked him to defend it. He put his hand flat on the wood, showed her a place where the figure went quiet for about 1.5 inches across the wrist, then said he did not trust 1.5 inches of quiet in the middle of that much noise. She looked at it for a long time. He was right. She had been about to be wrong. That was the evening she stopped thinking of him as help. The call from the Platte County Historical Society came on a Tuesday in June of 2001. The Meridian buildings had been sold to a developer. The site was being cleared. The old lumber storage barn on the east end had come down that week. In the rafters of that building, the demolition crew had found walnut. Not scrap, slabs, dry stacked flat on the tie beams above the storage bay, out of the weather, out of sight in a part of the structure nobody had climbed into since the sale in 1990. The society had called the newspaper. The newspaper had remembered the March 1997 article. Somebody in Columbus had put two things together. She drove over that afternoon with Toby. There were 43 pieces laid out on the concrete in the rubble, ranging from 2 feet to 6. She walked the row once without touching anything. The oxidation on the cut ends ran from pale to nearly black, which meant some of them had been up in those rafters 15 years, while others had been there 25 or 30. Every single piece was figured. Not one plain board in the lot. Crotch, curl, fiddleback, the size of a dinner plate, wood that had been rejected by a casket company for the exact reasons it was standing there in the sun, making a young man of 23 stop talking in the middle of a sentence. The contractor wanted them gone by Friday. He asked her what they were worth. She could have said anything. She told him $400, which was more than he expected, which was a fraction of what any one of the 4 best pieces would carry finished. They loaded them in the truck in 1 hour and 10 minutes. She found the mark that evening in her own yard, unloading in the last of the light, on the 6th piece she picked up, a slab 28 inches long, with a crotch figure so violent it looked like weather. On the butt end, under the oxidation, faint but unmistakable in the low sun, there was a mark in blue grease pencil, a number, written in her grandfather's hand. She sat down on the tailgate holding it. She went through the other 42 pieces that night with a work light. 31 of them carried marks, numbers on the ends, his 4 tiers, some of them so old the grease had gone chalky, some of them written over sap that had bled after the mark was made. She knew that handwriting better than her own. She had spent 14 years watching it fill 3 ledgers at the north bench under a window. She called Wendell Prosser at 8 o'clock the next morning. He was 75 years old, working 3 days a week at the hardware store, still living on 26th Street. She told him what she had found. He did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had something in it she had never heard from him, which was a man being caught out by his own mind. He told her about the stroke first, because it was the only way the rest of it made sense. Small one. Spring of 1993, 3 days in the hospital in Columbus, no weakness left over, nothing anybody could see. What it took was a strip out of the middle of his life. Not the recent part, not childhood, the 70s. He had lost most of the 70s, the way you lose a room in a house you no longer enter. Still there, door painted shut. His wife had spent a year filling gaps in for him at the supper table. Then he told her what the grease pencil brought back, which had come up out of nowhere the instant she described it. Whole in color, the way those things return. From 1972 on, Halvor had not waited for the truck. He had come to the yard, most weeks, sometimes twice, and Prosser had let him walk the reject stack himself, before the loaders got to it, because it was garbage, because nobody upstairs cared, because a yard foreman is allowed to decide who takes the trash. Halvor would go through the pile with a grease pencil in his shirt pocket, mark what he wanted, load what he could carry. The best pieces he did not load. He put them up in the rafters of the storage barn, 1 or 2 at a time, on a ladder Prosser held for him more times than he could count, in a part of the building that never got used, where wood would stay dry, flat, dark, undisturbed. He had done it for years. When Prosser had finally asked him about it sometime in the early 80s, Halvor had told him he was not ready for those pieces yet. She asked what he had meant by that. He never explained it. A drawer opened somewhere in a hardware store in Columbus. I always figured he meant they were too good to cut before he got better. Then Prosser corrected himself, because he had known the man 40 years. Later on, I thought he meant something else, that he'd have to do something with a piece like that. Couldn't just hang it on a wall for the neighbors. Then he said the part that cost him, that he had carried it 14 years without once thinking to tell her, that it had not been kindness or a promise or any decent reason at all. That a doctor in Columbus had reached into him in 1993 and taken out the one room where a ladder and a man with a grease pencil were still standing. She told him it was found now, which was the only true comfort available. Halvor Lindqvist had stored the best walnut of his life above a Casket factory storage bay for 15 years, telling himself he was not good enough for it yet, dying in November of 1986 without ever going back for one piece. The developer's crew had taken the roof off that building 3 weeks before the wood would have gone into a landfill in Butler County. She worked those 43 pieces over the next 4 years. Slowly, one or two at a time, out of order, never more than one on the bench at once. She set aside the 9 best for what she and Toby came to call the shelf, which was not a shelf, which was a rack in Zone 1 with nothing else on it. Wood she was not going to cut until she knew exactly what it deserved to be. She was 43 years old in the fall of 2004, with 3 employees, a shop that had been rewired twice, a 20-month wait. Prices at $780 standard, $1,200 for the top tier. 109 active accounts in 26 states. The hay ground was still hers. The house needed a new porch post, still. She was in Albion on a Thursday in October to pick up mail at the post office window, standing at the counter, waiting for the postmaster to come back from the sorting room with a package too big for her box. Cy Barlow was at the far end of the co-op counter with 4 men. He was 68 by then, semi-retired, still holding court between the coffee pot and the seed rack, still the loudest instrument in the building. He had a story going about a fellow from Colorado who had come through town in a rental car the week before asking for directions out to the Lindqvist place, some outfit, in Denver. A man who had flown into Omaha, driven 2 hours, then driven 2 hours back the same day, for a piece of wood, Barlow told them. One of the men allowed as how he had heard she had a 2-year waiting list. Barlow laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, which was the thing about him, which was the thing about the whole county. It was the laugh of a man who has been given a fact that will not fit inside anything he believes. So he sets it down outside the door where he can keep laughing at it. He asked them who in the world pays $1,200 for a piece of walnut out of a barn in Boone County. Greta took the package from the postmaster. She tucked her mail under her arm. For about 3 seconds, she considered walking out the other door. She had done it in 1989 over a smaller version of the same sentence, had driven home with her jaw locked, had spent 15 years knowing she should have turned around. There were 4 men at that counter who would repeat whatever happened next in 9 kitchens by Sunday. She walked the length of that counter, which was maybe 18 feet, in front of 5 men who all knew who she was. She set the package down on the counter beside Barlow's coffee. Sigh. Her voice was not raised. Nobody in that store had ever heard it raised. I'll tell you exactly who pays $1,200. She told them about the man from Colorado. He built rifles for outfitters who guide elk in the flat tops. The rifle that piece is going on will sell for $14,000. The man who buys it will carry it for 20 years. His son will carry it after that. She let that number sit in the room a second because she had learned something about pauses from a salesman in 1990. Then she told them the part she had been waiting 17 years to say to somebody at that counter. The wood is the only part of that rifle he touches. She put one hand flat on the package. Steel he cleans. Glass he looks through. The wood is what's against his cheek every time he raises it, in his hands every day he carries it. For 2 generations. She looked at Barlow directly. $1,200 for the one part of a $14,000 tool that a man puts his face on is not expensive, Cy. It's the opposite of expensive. It's the cheapest thing in the whole transaction. Barlow did not say anything. She picked up her package. She walked out. The bell over the door did what it had done since 1954. Behind her, one of the men set down his coffee, then said into the quiet that he had not realized she was doing that kind of business. Another one, older, who had known Halvor, answered him. He said she had been doing it since before any of them knew what she was doing. He said her grandfather had been doing it before that, in the same building, out of the same wood, for nothing at all. Neither of those men was saying anything new. They were saying the thing that had been standing in plain sight in that county for 30 years, waiting for somebody to notice it. Rolf Halvorson brought the rifle over. 11 days later, the one his father had bought off Halvor in 1968 for $40. He was 79. He had been thinking about bringing it over for 15 years. He did not explain what had finally moved him, though everybody involved knew. She took it into the shop, put it under the lamp, turned it in her hands for a while. It was early work. The comb was too high. The wrist was thicker than it needed to be, the way a man makes it thick when he is not yet sure of the wood. But the piece had been cut off a hedgerow tree with the grain running true through the narrowest part, oiled by hand, and the figure came up under that single lamp after 36 years the way it had come up the day he finished it. She told Rolf what it was worth. He sat down on the stool. Emery Vance died in Scottsdale in March of 2003 at 81, 3 weeks after finishing a rifle for a customer in Utah. She learned it from his daughter, who called on a Sunday, then followed the call with a crate that arrived 11 days later by freight. Inside it, packed in the same kind of newspaper Greta had used in 1987, was a stock. It was number 4. The one out of the first 6 with the grain running wrong through the wrist. The one he had refused to put on a rifle for hard country. The one he had told her about in September of 1987 in the flattest voice a man can use. The one he had said he would keep for a shop gun of his own rather than send back. He had never made it into a shotgun. He had never made it into anything. It had hung on a nail over his bench in Arizona for 16 years, oiled once a year, unfinished at the butt. A young woman's mistake preserved by a man who had built rifles for half a century. There was a card in the crate in the slanted architect's hand. 4 lines, written sometime before the end. He wrote that he was leaving it to her because it was the only piece of her work he had ever owned that was not perfect. He wrote that he had kept it where he could see it as a reminder of the one thing he had learned late, and she had learned early, which is that a person who can hear the word wrong from a stranger without flinching will end up outlasting every person who cannot. He wrote that she had heard it at 26, over a telephone, from a man she had never met, then had gone out to a barn that same night to work. The last line said he had told a great many people about her wood over 16 years, and that not one time had he mentioned the number 4. She hung it on the north wall of the shop next to the tool nails. She did not explain it to anybody who worked there. Toby figured it out inside of a year, on his own, from the grain, which was the way she would have wanted it. The last piece off the casket works rafters. The 28-inch slab with the crotch figure like weather. The one that had carried a blue grease pencil number on its butt end for 29 years. She worked in the spring of 2005. She cut it herself, alone, on a Sunday with the shop closed. It took her 3 weeks. When it was finished, she oiled it 7 times by hand, the way she had learned at 15, rubbed each coat out until her palm went hot, then hung it above the bench where the tool nails were. She never sold it. She never priced it. Customers who came out to the shop, which by then was a thing men did, driving from Wyoming or Michigan to spend an hour with a woman who would tell them the truth about wood, all of them saw it inside of 4 minutes. All of them asked. Toby was 27 that year, cutting a third of the production under his own hand, 3 years from being made a partner. He asked her about it in June. In the evening, after the others had gone, he had asked before, in a general way, had gotten a general answer. This time he asked why that one, out of everything that had gone across that bench. She took it down off the wall, turned it over, held the butt end under the lamp so the light raked across the old grain. The mark was still there, under the finish, faint as a bruise. A number in blue grease pencil in a dead man's handwriting. She put her thumb beside it, not on it. My grandfather wrote that in a lumber yard in Columbus, sometime in the early 70s. Her voice went down to almost nothing. Then he climbed a ladder, put this piece in the rafters where nobody would find it, came home, told himself he wasn't good enough for it yet. Toby looked at the mark for a long moment. He asked her how long it stayed up there. She told him. 15 years while he was alive, another 15 after. Then she hung it back on the nail, squared it, stood there with her hands still on the wood. That's why it doesn't come down. She was not looking at Toby anymore. Everything else in this shop is what the wood turned into. That one's what it costs to wait for permission. She went into the house, came back out with the third ledger under her arm. The cloth, one with 40 pages of shop names in a small, careful hand, and the rest of it filled in a hand that had never been as neat. She put it on the bench in front of him.